Welcome to PledgeMonitor. This is the first episode of many in which I'll be exploring members of parliament and their records. So we look at Rishi Sunak and we ask the question is how well did Rishi Sunak actually deliver on what he promised Britain and what he promised Richmond? Today we're not looking at headlines, we're looking at the record. This is PledgeMonitor, the platform that tracks political power, how politicians vote, who funds them, and whether the promises they make to their constituents or to the nation and how that is reflected in the data. In the next few minutes, we'll examine Rishi Sunak's voting record, his funding landscape around his leadership, and whether the 5 core pledges he made became measurable outcomes. There's no opinions, it's just documented records. So let's expand more about Rishi Sunak right now, who's the former Prime Minister, but he does represent Richmond, which is a constituency in North Yorkshire. It's a largely rural constituency made up of market towns, farming communities, tourism businesses, and it has military families which are connected to Gatwick Garrison. It doesn't have the same amount of issues as you would think as like an inner city community or people would have, but it does have very similar issues. It has, the households are facing higher energy charges, fuel costs. There's, but they do have big differences. Mainly how farmers are dealing with and adjusting to post-Brexit subsidy changes, how communities are spread across the large distances, which is something which is quite common within rural communities, how they spread across from each other, but not only that, they have access to public services like the NHS and how spread across it is. Broadband transport gaps. So there are issues even today within the UK, different spots within the UK, which has low broadband speed. Drastically improved over the years, but there's still gaps, still issues within those rural communities. There's also small hospitality businesses within those constituencies, especially like Richmond, which are vulnerable to economic shocks. So the key question becomes, do his decisions in Westminster reflect the realities of the constituency he represents? So let's go into it. Let's examine the record behind the rhetoric. So as Chancellor and later as Prime Minister, Sunak exported major fiscal and immigration policies that shaped the country's direction. One key decision was backing an increase in national insurance contributions. That move raised tax on workers during a period of economic strain, with the government arguing it would fund health and social care. Supporters called it reasonable fiscal management. Critics argued it placed additional burden on working households during cost of living crisis. He also backed the Rwanda migration policy designed to small boat crossings by relocating asylum seekers. The policy became central to his pledge to stop the boats. It was legally challenged and politically divisive, but it signaled where immigration ranked among his priorities. On climate, he supported adjustments to net zero timelines, delaying certain targets in the name of economic realism. People viewed this as pragmatism, but the environmental group described it as backtracking. Across the decisions, a pattern emerges: fiscal restraint, controlled public spending, and hard line on immigration. Let's look into different aspects of what he did. So if you look into the voting record, it's not a surprise to see, for example, in the way he votes and his hard line on his fiscal decisions he's made. These are the votes. If you look at the universal credit and person independent reading, the second reading, which was on July 1st, he voted no, and the reason for that is he didn't want the two-child benefit gap to be uplifted. So it makes sense, given what he had said during his premiership, given what I just said about how he did some economic decisions which did strain people or seemed to strain people. There was this, so him not lifting the two-child benefit goes along with his ethos. Surprising, which I do want to have more data on, which is the terminally ill end of life. Third reading, why he voted yes. Of course, he had something to do with vapes. He did have push that through. And if you go to some of the motions he tried to passed the quickest were his safety of Rwanda. Rwanda was his main thing, which I think he fell on. No flights left for Rwanda. There was big problems legally within, legal decisions, etc. But it's something, as you can see here, he did try to push this through quite quickly. He wanted this done as quickly as possible to move on with what he thought would be best. Now, that's his voting record, and anybody from Richmond can go through this and he can view it and he can analyze to see how he votes currently, how he did vote, etc. So if you go into the financial interests, so if you look at donations received, now this is all done so it's easy readable and people can follow. There may be some duplicates, but that's just, there's teething issues which would be improved. So the employment earnings through our different entries. Now, this is always updated. Once a week, all these entries are always updated. So you may always have new headings. It's just because of the way it's dealt with. Now, there's one thing that we have to note, which is, interested and people who listen may find this interesting, was before politics, Sunak worked at Goldman Sachs and he worked at larger hedge funds. His financial background did become a national talking point during the cost of living crisis because people thought that he was out of touch for many reasons, his background, but also because of his wife, her father, which is who Sunak's father-in-law is a billionaire within India. So, people thought that he was out of touch. He didn't know how to connect with working class people or people within, those sort of classes. And this is something which was used against him because of who he worked with. And we can look into the financial interest right now and we can see um, how all this would fare. The one thing which we have to also remember was there was 5 key pledges Sunak made. Half inflation, grow the economy, reduce national debt, cut the NHS waiting lists, and stop small votes. We looked at the voting record and we can see that a lot of the decisions or the votes he made, he tried to push through where to reflect these. But some people will argue, for example, not lifting the two child benefit cap would leave to further. It wouldn't grow the economy, would hold the economy. It's that issue. So when we look into it, we look into donations now. So we look into financial. So miscellaneous would be, his unpaid roles, of course, his wife. He has a lot of, advisory roles, being in councils, advisory boards, speaking roles. It's quite common for ex-prime ministers to get a lot of speaking roles. You look into the donations received. You look into employment earnings, which I see a lot of people will look into. And it's quite substantial amount to be received for payment. You look at who he works with. So he's speaking, as I said, Sunday Times columnist, senior advisor for Microsoft, Anthropic, which is an AI company, Goldman Sachs, which he worked as an advisor there, Washington Speakers Bureau. That's quite common. So he still has some links to Goldman Sachs. He works for, or seems to advise an AI company. Gifts and hospitality, people who, gift to people. Shareholding, his land and properties, he does have, I think he only has one property in London, so this may be incorrect, which is 2, he may just have 1, which will need to be rectified. Of course, again, his employment and earnings. So we're looking into this and we can see those financial records. And the one thing which I think is important is to look at not only what person votes or MP votes in Parliament, what their financial records are, speeches they make. So, of course, he makes speeches on Ukraine. Again, going back to rural communities, the local bus services, and how it could help his communities, vital to them. So it seems as if he's speaking about that. But it's also seen as how he approaches social media. You look at the AI race, again, he's an advisor for Anthropic, so there may be a linkage there. So these things are all important when looking at a member of parliament. And the reason why I did it in this way, and I created this platform, is so we could look into MPs at a holistic level. We can make sure that we can check, their voting records, their financial records, their interests, their social media, how they post, what the speeches they give, and of course any news articles. How is the news explaining or looking at them? He's looking at football programs. He's looking into energy partnerships. He's looking at veteran support subs, etc. Now, this is all within different news outlets. So, Darling Stockton Times, Happening Today, the Northern Echo, etc. And if you're really interested, you can just go and just Google them and look into those articles. So, when we look into those pledges he made, we looked at the financials. So, he still has seems to be advised for AI company Goldman Sachs. Seems to be getting good amount of employment and earnings. He has different roles. There's always that debate about should MPs have second jobs. So, people who are interested can look into this and make an assumption for themselves looking at the data. We see that when it comes to Sunak's pledges, the results are mixed. The boats didn't really stop. Inflation or growth did seem modest. The debt level did stay historically high, and the NHS waiting list did not get cut. There were some reductions some places, but not as impactful as he had hoped. The one thing that we do have to know that Sunak did govern during turbulence, post-pandemic debt, global inflation, energy shocks, and internal party instability. His leadership style was managerial rather than ideological, stability over expansion, control over ambition. So we then have to ask the question that now he's not the prime minister. We have to see how his approach has tailored now towards his constituents and if he's delivering. So this episode which we've gone through, as I will go through all episodes, we're not looking at personalities, we're looking at data, we're looking at people vote, we're looking at the constituency they represent, and if they are aligning within that constituency, or if there's any third-party influences which they may be voting for. Now that's what we do. We track whether politicians' promises align with their decisions, or whatever they say within social media or speeches align with the decisions they make within the parliament, or whether what they say on social media is not the same as what they say in parliament. And you'd be surprised a lot of people do not track onto those things because number one, sometimes the data is quite difficult to finding those speeches. And that's why this platform is needed. It gives people the opportunity to look into those and find those issues. So that's been the first episode of PledgeMonitor. Hope you've enjoyed listening, looking into how PledgeMonitor works, why we've looked into Rishi Sunak, as I said, he's ex-Prime Minister. Good to see how he was doing while he's Prime Minister now that he's on the opposition benches. So, as I always say, democracy works best when citizens look beyond rhetoric and examine the data. There's too much divide right now, and I think the unifying force could be the data. Look at what the politicians are doing, not what they're saying. Till next time.